Welcome. It's wonderful to see you all on this beautiful fall day. My name is Joe McCaffrey. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm here to introduce this next event of our Brains, Minds, and Machines seminar series, which is the first time we've done that this year. So just to say a couple announcements about the event and some modifications to it due to some unforeseen circumstances with one of our speakers. But just to talk a little bit about the event, we in the Department of Philosophy envisioned a speaker series that would bring in people who work at the cutting edge of the interdisciplinary intersection between philosophy and the mind-brain sciences. So philosophy and neuroscience, philosophy and artificial intelligence and computer science, philosophy and psychology, human and animal. And so we put together this series of events this year to showcase the ways that philosophy and the mind-brain sciences can productively interact in research. And today's event will have now two speakers who are going to talk to you about topics at the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience. One of the reasons we put this on, I wanted to make sure to say, is we have always had a strong presence in our philosophy department in brains and minds, and we've actually retooled and added machines. So we're launching our Brains, Minds, and Machines concentration of our major this year, which is a course of study that allows you to do serious work in philosophy, philosophy of consciousness, philosophy of emotions, philosophy of mind, while also taking classes in the mind-brain sciences or in artificial intelligence. And so it's also in launching this newly minted Brains, Minds, and Machines concentration program that we're having this series of events. So the kind of sad note and the modification, we have intending to join us today, Raphael Perez from Rochester, who's going to come and talk to us about his work on modularity in animal minds and chimpanzees. And unfortunately, he just had completely disastrous travel circumstances and was unable to be here. And so we actually are going to reschedule him later in this event series so he can come and talk to us and we can have a good dialogue rather than something, sort of rushed or stressed out from the Detroit airport and such. So one thing that'll mean, so we have two speakers for today instead of three, which is, really sad. But also that the scheduling will be a little different. We might have a little more time devoted to the talks, and also the schedule might be a little sort of more amorphous than anticipated, but we do plan that Professor Sarah Robbins will start now with this talk, and then I'm guessing Professor Corey Maley will start his talk somewhere in the 2:30 range. My last sort of nuts and bolts announcement is that we have snacks and drinks available for you. So if you go outside, there's a bench that has veggie straws, granola bars, bag chips, and also LaCroix and sodas and things like that, and those are for you. Okay, so those are all my nuts and bolts announcements. And now I'm extremely pleased to introduce our first speaker for today, which is Professor Sarah Robbins. To say a few words about Sarah Robbins. Sarah Robbins is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kansas, so sort of our near neighbors, just a few hours away. And she's also an affiliate of the PhD program in Cognitive and Brain Sciences offered through psychology and part of a new cognitive science initiative at the university. Sarah did her PhD at the Department of Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology at WashU in St. Louis with someone who's near and dear to me, Carl Craver, before where she is today. And the main thing to say about Professor Robbins is that she's one of the very leading figures in the philosophy of memory. So there's a small community of philosophers who work on memory as a topic and who look at how we can understand human memory. Is it veridical? Are our memories prone to falsehoods? Do we really have traces of memories that were put down at one time and retrieved later? And all the questions at the intersection of the philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology of memory. And so she's, in addition to having current grant projects on this and being involved with a number of initiatives, has just written many articles on different aspects of memory, including its manipulation using techniques in neuroscience like optogenetics, the nature of false memory, critiques of the constructivist picture of memory, and so forth. And so without rambling too much more, I'll just say that I'm really excited to have her come talk to us today.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? If you stop hearing me at some point and you're in the back, just flail and I'll get the message. So thank you so much for having me and having us. It's really exciting to be here for this event in particular. And This is my first time giving a talk in front of other people instead of in my slippers at home since March of 2020. So I'm very excited about that. I also feel really out of practice. So, but yeah, it's really nice to be here. So thank you so much for having us and giving us this chance to do this. I can take my mask off. Is that
You're upfront enough.
okay? Yeah, if that feels all right to everyone. Yeah, that might work. I also have not gotten to do that in a long time. So I'm excited to talk to you all about this project today. It is, in a way, what I want to sketch today is a kind of broader picture of background of work I've been doing, and is the kind of basis for a book project on memory traces that I'm in the midst of, which kind of summarizes and expands on work I've been doing for a while. So most of my, oops, getting ahead of myself. Most of my research focuses on the idea of a memory trace. So trying to make sense of what this is and how we should think about it. Sometimes the memory trace, especially in lower level cellular, molecular, and neurobiological studies of memory, is referred to as the engram. For the purposes of what I want to say today, we can understand those things as being roughly synonymous. So there's more to say about that. So if you have questions about that, we can talk about it. So the memory trace has been at the center of the things I'm interested in about memory for a long time. And I really like this quotation from Endel Tolving. If you know anything about memory, you might know Endel Tolving is sort of very prominent psychologist of memory, the one who gave us the distinction between episodic and semantic memory. And so Tolving says, an event happens and a person experiences it. Memory traces are laid down representing the past event. The past vanishes and is replaced by the present. The memory traces of the event continue to exist in the present. They're retrieved and the person remembers the event. This, in a nutshell, has been the understanding of how memory works. It is simple and straightforward. There is no need for or room for magic or for marvel. And perhaps he's right that we don't need any magic or marvel, but we do actually need to say more about what a memory trace is than simply this. So there's more that needs to be said about what counts as a memory trace, in part because once any theorist, psychologist, neuroscientist, philosopher, or otherwise starts to say more about memory traces, they very quickly start to appeal to metaphors of memory. So the memory trace, as we understand it, is often characterized to us in ways like an impression in wax, for Aristotle, birds in an aviary at some points in the way Plato talked about it. You might think of it in terms of grooves in a phonographic record. In more contemporary empirical accounts, you might liken it to sort of the way memory functions in a computer system, or files or archives in a library, a camera obscura, a photo album, a loom. There are many metaphors that have been used, all of which are somewhat interesting and might tell you certain things about a theorist. What they don't do is tell you much about how you might understand actually what a memory trace is. And of course, memory and memory traces are not the only place where we use metaphors to make sense of various cognitive capacities or other things. This is a common, right? We use the technologies of our time to sort of think through various cognitive capacities. That in general is well established. I think that practice, though, in memory as opposed to other areas, is especially entrenched and pernicious and not eventually cashed out in anything more than the metaphor. So despite the centrality of this notion and its persistence from Plato to contemporary neuroscience, we don't often get a richer sense of what the memory trace might actually be, what is going on with the memory trace. And so the central kind of orienting questions for the project that I've been involved in are, what the heck is the memory trace beyond this idea, right? And why is it that a view of memory seems to require them? So why is this so quickly invoked or evoked in accounts of memory as we find them? So what's bringing that about? So I think going back to that fundamental question is important for setting out an account that can make sense of both the kind of philosophical tradition of appealing to these things, but also the commitments that are implicit in the methodological practice of the contemporary science of memory. Okay, so the aim for today, oops, now it's going too fast, is to make the case to you, again, elliptically. I'm kind of sketching there are a lot of arguments that I'm going to be sort of going over rather quickly, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A or later or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to talk about the details of those further. So I want to defend the idea that there's a core conception of the memory trace. There is sort of what I'm going to think about in terms of something like a minimal conception, right? Something that is rich enough to be the kind of thing that you could tell, is this an account, a trace account or not, and yet leaves a lot of room in the account for individual theorists to sketch out what the theory of representation or the particular details of that account are going to be. And then I think that, so not only is there a coherent notion of a memory trace that exists in the philosophy and science of memory, but also that it's not just there and makes sense, but it's one we shouldn't get rid of. So I'm not going to take a great deal of time in what I talk about today to defend this idea. But in some ways, some of the literature that Professor McCaffrey gestured at a little bit ago regarding the sort of malleability of memory, that are sort of the ways in which our memories are easily distorted and manipulated in ways that we don't often recognize. That empirical literature over the past several decades is part of one set of empirical trends that have made people think like memory is just really different than we thought it was. We used to think it was some kind of archive or repository, but now look at all the ways our memories can be easily like sort of mislead us. And if that's right, then we've got to really rethink things. And while we rethink things, we should get rid of that old fuddy-duddy trace idea that we never fully unpacked to begin with. Like definitely our memories aren't impressions in wax. So like, you know, we just need to chuck the whole metaphor and the account along with it. I think once we have a richer account, we can actually withstand a lot of the challenges that people have thought that were a barrier to having a sort of trace account of memory. So defend the idea that there is some kind of conception, and then argue not just that there is one, but that we should keep it around. Okay, so there is a sort of basic idea for memory. If you have studied memory, especially in psychology or neuroscience, you know there are lots of forms of memory, right? You can remember your 6th birthday, you can remember your states and capitals, you can remember how to throw a particular kind of pitch in a baseball game. These are all different ways. You can remember what it was like to be a kid growing up in a particular place, right? These are all different forms and kinds of memory. At the sort of heart of what makes something, such that it could be a subset or a kind of memory, there is a kind of basic idea behind that. And that is that you as an organism, as a person, undergo some sort of experience. You have some kind of experience, whether that is your 6th birthday or being drilled on your states and capitals or, growing up in whatever location it is. As a result of that experience, there is some sort of change to you. And then because of that change, you can remember, you're able to retain or play or re-express. I shouldn't have used the word remember there without sort of building that in, but you can build back that, you can bring back that experience, right? So that's a sort of core idea, right? If I stopped my presentation right now and started, I don't know, doing the Macarena, and then I just abruptly went back to my talk, you might at some point later, having some of the refreshments in the hallway, like strike up a conversation about what on earth I was doing when that happened, right? And your ability to do that later, as a function, right, would have something to do with retaining, right? There's a way in which whatever you experienced had some kind of impact on you, as a result of which you can later speculate about my sanity, right? So the idea that there is that kind of underlying commitment, the memory trace is picking out that change, right? The sort of experience-dependent change that is thereby later thing that makes it possible for you to later think about, put to use, apply, or express the previous thing, right? And so this is speaking very, very loosely about what the kind of phenomena of a memory trace is. And I think for philosophers, so philosophers and neuroscientists, I think, share that kind of orienting conception to what memory is and the role that a memory trace plays. For philosophers, the question is, why do we need one? Why think that that is the case? Why does this kind of move get you there? Whereas for, say, particularly for neuroscientists, the question is, how is a memory trace implemented, or where is it, right? Is it in this particular area of the brain? Is it this particular connection between neurons? Those are the kinds of questions that that neuroscientists have. So I think this isn't yet to the kind of minimal conception, but this is kind of the background that gets you headed in that direction. So for philosophers haven't spent, I mean, as I said, there's a kind of tendency to wax metaphorical about what memory is and how it works and what the memory trace itself is. So there isn't often a great deal of focus on giving arguments for why remembering requires a memory trace. You can extract some arguments from philosophical writings, and I think these are three of the most prominent that exist. I wasn't intending to go into the three of them in detail, but I'll talk a little bit about the first one, and we can talk more about the others in detail if you're interested. But these are sort of arguments that philosophers have given for why there has to be a memory trace, which in the end, all of them end up falling flat. They end up not sort of succeeding in presenting to us a sufficient reason for thinking that there is a memory trace. And I think from the lessons we can learn from those cases, we get an idea of a better way to do that. So one common way of thinking about why you might need a memory trace is that you might think, I need something there to sort of stand in for the past event. You could think this for a number of reasons. One, because, so let's say I'm remembering my 6th birthday. One, like I'm not 6 anymore. And so like my 6th birthday is in the past, and depending on your view of time, and if you, especially if you hold a kind of view that requires the sort of object of your mental state to be contemporaneous with the entertainer. I need some sort of object for my thought to refer to. And my 6th birthday is disqualified because it's not here. Then you need a stand-in representation of that state now so that I have something for my thought to be about. Right? Not all views are going to hold this, but some views do. So that's one way you get into a kind of argument that you need memory traces in order to be able to think about past events. You could also have that kind of view because you need something to serve as this sort of thing you find when you go searching through your memory, right? So like we all at some level of description often feel like we, sometimes you're like, oh, my 6th birthday. Do you remember your 6th birthday? And if you think about it, you might feel as if you're kind of rummaging through whatever is the like photo storage device of your generation, right? Trying to find the image, mental image that corresponds to that birthday party. And so whatever counts as the thing you find when you engage in that search, the trace is the kind of success point of that retrieval action. These views of memory traces are difficult. Thinking of the memory trace as the sort of representation of the past gets these sorts of views into trouble because they require the memory trace to sort of have its features available on its surface in ways that get you into trouble. So the retrieval one is the easiest one to see. In part, you end up in a version of the kind of puzzle that we've been familiar with at least since Plato, right? Where you say, like, how did I know this was the image of my 6th birthday party unless I already knew what my 6th birthday, like, how did I say that's the right one, right? The one that has the pink bike and the, the yellow streamers, that's when I got my 6th birthday party. If I didn't already know that, I wouldn't recognize that image as the image of my 6th birthday party. So it looks like the image isn't succeeding in telling me that. I had to already remember it in order to be there. And so these accounts get themselves into a kind of circularity. Similarly, the sort of having a representation, sort of needing the representation of the past event to stand in as an object requires that you think that requires or suggests that whether or not this is the right object and has the right sort of accuracy conditions should be the kind of thing that's transparently available in that state, which the literature on false memory also tells us we're not actually all that good. So sometimes when we aren't remembering, but we think that we are highly confident in our misrememberings. And so the sort of features and the events to which they correspond are not transparent to us on the face of those traces. So arguments of that sort for a memory trace don't work. That's part of, and from those kinds of cases, I draw the sort of inference that the account of memory traces that we want is not going to be at the personal level. It's not going to be, whether something counts as a memory trace or not, is not going to be on the basis of what it feels like or what features it has that are accessible to you. Right? It's not going to be on the basis of whether it's an image or whether that image feels particularly vivid or accurate or whether you take it to be of a particular event. Right? We're looking for a kind of subpersonal explanation. There are similar flaws with other arguments that people have given for why it is that we need a trace. So we've sort of been lacking a good account of why we needed memory trace. And I think the best, of course, I think it's the best because it's my argument for why we need a memory trace. But the most compelling argument for why we need a memory trace actually involves paying attention to to memory science, to the ways that we study memory, and thinking about what we learn about how memory works from those kinds of cases. So to give you a very fast version of that, right? It's something I've been calling roughly, for lack of a better term, because it's just been me stuck at home all the time, a particularity argument, right? That the best explanation for why you need a memory trace is our ability to retain particular past experiences. That one thing, despite the fact that we do often commit memory errors, if we're thinking about human memory, that our memories are malleable and prone to distortion and manipulation and occasionally confabulation, it's nonetheless the case that sometimes we get things right. And sometimes even those misrememberings involve distortions of individual particular events that we retain. And we're not the only kinds of animals that do this sort of thing. The ability to retain particular past events, again, like the sort of thing I'm guessing that if I actually had done the Macarena in the middle of my talk, that would be the only time you'd seen someone do that in the middle of giving you a philosophy presentation, right? And you would later, I'm really not going to do it, but if I did, then you would have a story that you could tell. You would have that ability to retain and think about that past event later. And again, I'm just sort of gesturing at the arguments because I'm trying to give you a sort of broader lay of the land, but we can come back to this. In order to really explain your ability to retain those individual instances, we require sort of, if we think about what is required for explaining your ability to do that, to hold on to particular things, that requires a certain kind of cognitive architecture. It requires that your mind be situated in such a way, or structured in such a way, that at least some of the past experiences you have, you hold on to in this kind of individual form. That you're at least capable of doing that, and other organisms are as well. That capacity to retain past experience, particular past experiences, that's what the memory trace best explains. It's sort of where it's most needed. So if we look at other accounts of cognition and memory that don't make appeals to memory traces, or try not to do that, to explain them in other ways, they'll fall short of being able to explain that sort of thing. They won't be able to explain how it is that you can remember these particular past events. Okay, so here's a version of that argument more spelled out. I forgot I had that on the next slide. So at least sometimes we remember particular past experiences or events or episodes. Had I done the Macarena, you would remember that. You might not remember your 6th birthday party, but you probably remember some birthday party, right? There are times when you remember things that have only happened to you once. And as a lot of memory science will tell you, there are reasons why those kinds of novel events stand out to you in particular ways. But and sometimes the events aren't entirely novel. Maybe you make oatmeal for breakfast every morning, but there's something about what happened one particular Tuesday and it just is stuck in your head and you remember it, right? Those instances are genuine sort of central cases of remembering. So the kinds of cases we want no one's going to get away with not failing to explain those kinds of cases because they're sort of core memories, right? If I say, give me a memory of your past, the kind of thing you're most likely to come up with is your 6th birthday or seeing a speaker to the Macarena. It's not going to be like, the capital of Kansas or something, right? In terms of their quintessentialness as memories, these are quintessential cases, right? And so the ability to retain particulars that's in that first case, right, it requires an explanation. And the best explanations, Professor McCaffrey gestured at sort of constructivist views. I'm not talking about those in detail here today, but some people who think this kind of trace idea is crusty and old and that we should get rid of it, want to posit other kinds of cognition in order to explain traces. And I think they actually can't. They can do really well at explaining some of the stuff you screw up, but they can't actually explain the cases where you're successful. In order to do that, you need a kind of memory trace. So again, I'm just trying to convince you that that's the case, right? So for neuroscientists then, so if that's kind of right, if that's sort of how you might handle the philosophical side of why you think memory traces are required. In neuroscience, what people are up to is trying to figure out how is a memory trace implemented? Where is it and how does it work? And in certain parts of neuroscience, this is referred to, as I said earlier, as an engram, owing in part to to Richard Zeman, who was a biologist at the turn of the 20th century, who is the one who coined the term engram for this purpose. He was forgotten about for a long time. He's sort of starting to make a comeback now. It's very exciting time to be talking about Richard Zeman, but that's in part because he was more broadly a Lamarckian. So if you know anything about sort of evolutionary theory, that was not a very, that was kind of brutal set of views to be holding. So he had other things in the background of his memory theory that sort of caused him to be somewhat shunned as a scholar. So the Engram idea stuck around, but Zeman didn't. As work on the basic mechanisms of memory has really exploded in the last decade or two, he's come kind of back into these discussions. But when he wrote a book called The Meme in 1904, where he put forward the idea that there had to be an Engram, not because he found one. In fact, he was actually skeptical that neuroscience would ever get sophisticated enough to find them, but he thought there had to be one, right? Basically, if I have an organism and I train it to do something, right, or I give it an experience so that it's afraid of what's in front of it, and then later it expresses that fear, there has to be a change in the brain that explains its ability to do that later. And that's the thing that's responsible for that memory, right? That thing is the Engram, says Zeman. So it's a sort of precondition on the possibility of remembering. And that is sort of built into the methodology and kind of search for the Engram that is the kind of fundamental task for neurobiology since Zeman. Right? And it's pervasive enough that even people, so if people know the term Engram, they often know it from Carl Lashley instead, because Carl Lashley wrote a paper called The Search for the Engram. So this quote from the 1950, I don't think it's from that exact paper, but so Lashley spent 15 to 20 years looking for engrams in various organisms. A lot of his work was in rabbits, right? And couldn't find it. So he was lesioning different parts of the brain to see whether or not he could find whatever structure it was that was responsible for that. And I like to use this quote because I think that it's illustrative of how central the commitment to Engram theory is, with the idea that there has to be one, that the guy who couldn't find one in 20 years of research said, well, then I guess memory doesn't happen, right? Because there's no way you could have memory if you didn't have the Engram. So it's a sort of central idea. And of course, now we know there were a lot of flaws with Lashley's methodology, and that's why Lashley didn't find the Engram. But it's again, a kind of reflection of the commitment amongst neuroscientists, right? And after Lashley, things got better in the sense that who worked with Lashley and others starting to give us ideas about how neurons communicate with each other and the ways in which once neurons do communicate with each other, they retain the effects of that kind of change. And mechanisms for long-term potentiation, which is, some of you might know a whole lot about that, maybe even more than I do, but the basics behind that are that there are going to be structural changes to neurons that interact with each other as a function of interacting with each other, as a way of keeping track of or showing the influence of particular events or experiences. So as we started to understand those basic details of neurons and the ways that they can communicate with each other, particularly in parts of the brain like the hippocampus, we were also learning things about human memory from the work of Brenda Milner and her colleagues working with the patient HM, Henry Maliason, right, who was one of the first and most prominent neuropsychological patients who had the kinds of memory deficits which involved a significant deficit to episodic memory. As a result, so he suffered from epileptic seizures and underwent a surgery to sever his corpus callosum when he was in his early 20s to help relieve those seizures. So cutting the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain can help with those kinds of seizures. Back in the early kind of Wild West days of neurosurgery, they really were, like there's some biographies that have come out recently. The stuff is wild. It's again, like topic for later, but like these were like just cutting people's brains open and thinking like, oh, let's just tear like, just damage this part and see what happens. So in severing his corpus callosum, they were a little bit sloppy with that process. And if you're sloppy with that process, the hippocampus sits right down there at the base of the corpus callosum, and you can basically just ruin that, which is what happened in the case of HM and other patients too, but his was the most severe, and Brenda Milner was one of the ones who recognized, like, it's true he's having less seizures, he also doesn't retain any episodic memories of events. So HM died in 2006, 2007, something like that. So he lived for quite a long time being studied. Most of that time, people like Brenda Milner, she's still alive, she just turned 103, who worked with him for the vast majority of this time, would have to reintroduce themselves to HM on a daily basis, right? So working with him repeatedly for years, he was no longer able to form memories of his particular, she could have performed the Macarena in front of him every day. It would have had no impact on his ability to remember her, at least at this kind of explicit level. But he could still learn to do different kinds of tasks, right? He could get better. He retained his semantic knowledge from the past, so he could do crossword puzzles so long as they didn't ask too much about things too far into the future. They're kind of general knowledge about the world. And he could, yeah, be trained to do different things procedurally, but he couldn't form any new episodic memories. So we start to learn that the hippocampus is really important for retaining these kinds of memories. And we start to learn a lot about the basic mechanisms by which the neurons in the hippocampus might be doing this. This starts to give us at least a rough account of what the kind of basis of these the sort of medium of these particular changes might be, because someone who doesn't have that anymore, has damage to that system, can no longer form those kinds of memories. Again, also, so we get, this is just a summary article from a couple of years ago, right? Now it's not just that people think that there is an engram, but we actually think we have a rough idea of what it is, right? That it's the formation of an engram involves strengthening the synaptic connections, those connections between neurons, right, that fire at the time that you have an experience. And it's particularly ones that are in the hippocampus for most kinds of memory that people think that's happening. So this is all supposed to say at some level that there is a sort of shared commitment to the idea as memory, as retaining information, retaining something from past experience, where the retention is made possible by some kind of change to the underlying system. And that's especially clear, sort of at its strongest, in cases of particular experiences where there's an identifiable change that corresponds to that particular experience, rather than sort of aggregate or sort of cumulative changes as a response of repetitive experiences. So I think from there, to sort of get yourself into a more fleshed out minimal conception of a memory trace, you can think, okay, so if that's the right sort of way to think, or why you might think that a memory trace is required, then what would a trace have to be like in order to play that role? If that's the kind of thing that it has to have, what features would it have to have in order to count, right? And I think in that case, ultimately what a memory trace has to have, I think of this in terms of a sort of dual nature account. There's sort of two important features to memory traces. That is, there has to be some kind of physical or structural change to the system that is of a certain kind, that is distinctive, it makes a sort of discrete impact on the underlying system and is persistent, the kind of thing that could persist. I'll say more about each of these in just a minute. And it has to be in some respects cognitive, where what I mean by that is there's going to have to be the kind of change that could bear content or support content, the kinds of things that involve representation or at least information. And again, this is the weaselly part of this part of the work only being a minimal conception, is that it's then left open to any particular account to say what the standard for cognitive is going to be. But where you set your standard is going to help you understand which things can count as memory traces and which can't. Oops. Did I go too far? Oh, yeah. So this is meant to be a kind of minimal conceptions of sorts. So the kinds of things that are required, although how you might flesh these out might differ across particular views. Oops, wrong direction. So there has to be a memory trace requires some kind of physical change. If you think that the best argument for why a memory trace is required is the ability to explain the retention of particular past experiences, then that constrains the set of options for the sort of underlying change that could be the basis for a memory trace. So you need, in order for the system to be set up in a way that could do this, it has to be the kind of system, or kind of change to the system that could persist in that kind of distinct or discrete way. So you need a way of thinking about, I put the picture of like strength training, weight training up here as a kind of contrast class, where you might think like for some kinds of experiences, both cognitive and physical, if you encounter them frequently enough, you build up generalizations or associations gradually as a function of that. So there's a sense in which a person's body as a consequence of an extended program of strength training, there will be physical changes to the system as a result of that. But the physical changes to the system are aggregate or cumulative changes as a function of doing this over and over, right? There aren't changes to the system. They're a function of doing this on Tuesday morning versus doing this on Thursday morning, right? And that's part of what you want in a training regime of this sort, right? You're supposed to stick with it and see these kinds of changes over time. As we all might know, doing this once is not going to revolutionize, right? your physique in any sort of way, right? So for that kind of system, we're thinking about something that is aggregate or cumulative. That's the opposite of the kind of structure or system that you would need in order to retain particular experiences. So you're going to need some kind of way of thinking about the underlying mental architecture that, even if it has ways of learning and generalizing and doing cumulative things, has space for the ability to retain discrete and distinct types of events. So that tells you the kind of commitment you'd have to the underlying structure, which rules out some parts of the underlying neural and cognitive structure and doesn't rule out others, right, as the kinds of things that could support that. Oops. If you think about the content, so if you think about what I mean by cognitive here, if you think that the sketch of what a trace is at some point says, like, well, what you need is that you have an experience, you undergo some change as a result of that experience, and then later, because of that change, you're led to think about that experience. You can think about a sort of boundary test case for that in terms of stubbing your toe. So suppose in the hotel room this morning, it was dark, I was walking around and I stubbed my toe really hard on one of the awkwardly placed pieces of furniture in a hotel room. And then, it leaves a very bad injury on my toe. The next day I'm trying to put on my shoe, right? And my toe now hurts when I try to put on my shoe. And that causes me to think about the fact that I stubbed my toe very clumsily the day before, right? It looks like what you have there is an experience that leaves a sort of enduring physical change as a result of which I can think about that past experience. That has some of the right features. It doesn't look like, it seems intuitively like we want to say that the way in which my stubbed toe relates to retaining that information is not as a memory trace for that. It's not as if that's the thing that's serving as the trace of the memory of stubbing my toe, right? And part of why it fails to count in the right way is that although it does remind me later of the content, there's not any way in which the content of what happened, the thing it is that I remember or that I've retained informationally, is carried by the toe, right? The toe reminds me and sort of reactivates whatever in this case might be serving as the trace of that experience. So there's a way in which whatever the change is that supports the memory trace, it has to be the kind of thing that can bear or support that kind of content. Now, of course, philosophers of mind and psychology and cognitive science can spend careers, multiple of them stacked on top of one another, trying to figure out where the boundary is between the cognitive and the non-cognitive, right? In terms of within a human being, which features are going to count, which parts count as cognitive or non-cognitive. Sadly, our other speaker isn't here today to talk about other kinds of animal minds where sort of push our boundaries on how we think about which creatures are going to count as cognitive in the right way. And maybe there's some interesting research on what looks like the basis of maybe plant memories. So there's an associative. There are plants that look like they are capable of undergoing certain kinds of associative conditioning. There are some particular change, they meet some of the criteria for retention. Whether those are sort of persistent, discrete physical changes, whether those are going to count as memory or not is going to depend on what you think what you want to pack into the notion of content or representation. I'm not here to say, in this particular talk anyway, how you should flesh out that word. I'm saying that once you have an account of what it takes for something to be cognitive, you'll know where your boundary is about which things could have memory traces or not, right? If you had a very broad or loose conception of cognitive, perhaps even the rings in a tree are going to count as distinct content-bearing, right, sort of memories of living another year for that tree. Nowadays, in terms of thinking about vaccine shots, so a lot of us are thinking about sort of immune system memory, right? The ways in which your immune system carries these memory cells that tag things in particular ways, whether the kind of information involved in that immune response counts as information or content bearing. Again, those are open questions. My approach is not to answer that here, but to say how you answer that would tell you which way to go or not go. Okay, so that is in a very broad brush, the sort of description of the core conception that a memory trace is a discrete and persistent structural feature of the system, which occurs as a result of an experience that is cognitive in the right sense of being content bearing or content supporting, and whose content reflects the features of that experience. So I want to say a few things briefly about defending this idea, again, so it's minimal, you can flesh this out with the particular accounts of the cognitive or neural architecture you think best support this view, and in terms of what you think cognition requires, that can be left up to individual accounts. A couple of things that I want to say. So if you think that that works as something like a general conception of a memory trace, then you can say like, okay, fine, you gave us some idea of what this thing is. Now we have a richer understanding of it before we sort of throw it away because contemporary science tells us we didn't need this thing in the first place. And so a couple of the things that many memory scientists and also philosophers of memory have thought as a challenge to the memory trace are sort of challenges from neurodynamics and challenges from the existence of memory errors. So I'll say a couple of things quickly about that, right? So both of these are challenges to how we think about how the trace can change over time. And the question is sort of whether or not this kind of core conception could accommodate those. That was initially supposed to play a little video. Is it? Oh, it's kind of playing. This was supposed to be like a bunch of neurons firing as a way of saying, as neuroscientists in recent years have paid an increasing amount of attention to neural dynamics and thinking like, although when you take classes in cellular and molecular biology and neurobiology, you're given sort of ideas about certain things happening in stages and in processes as if they're, you know, a lot of cells are clearly in one state or clearly in another state, or as if processes move in a very slow and linear way. But actually, the more we pay attention to the neural system, many theorists and scientists are arguing that we should be thinking about these things in terms of the kind of richer and dynamical systems that they are. And so if we're thinking seriously about how much the brain is always moving and acting, then it looks like if a commitment to sort of rethinking cognition in terms of neural dynamics might change the way we think about a lot of things. But one thing it's certainly going to cause problems for is this thing like a memory trace, right? If you think that memory requires some kind of persistent, stable, unchanging thing, and your new theory of the brain is that everything is constantly changing, then it looks like you don't get to have memory traces anymore, right? It looks like that just doesn't fit. And you can find lots of neuroscientists who say these sorts of things. So Alcino Silva says in a recent paper, right, if we think about, he's talking about molecular consolidation, which is a neuroscience word for thinking about how the basic mechanisms of memory are sort of formed in ways that stabilize, right? So your memory is like, you have an experience and you don't necessarily automatically remember those experiences. You have to undergo some additional processing to sort of make that memory stable and the kind of thing you could hold on to over time. And so consolidation is that molecular process, and right, the activation of all of the things that are going into that process, right, all of these things are way too dynamical and in flux to be the kinds of things that could be stable, right? And so there is no this sort of dogma, this idea that like, so consolidation is supposed to be the process by which a kind of loose memory becomes hardened and fixed in your head. And that process actually turns out to be like not clear. It's not clear when it ever started or when it ever stops. Then maybe nothing ever stabilizes in memory in the brain. Lynn Nadal is even more forceful, right? He says, few memory researchers in private defend the fixed memory trace paradigm. They know that memory is far more dynamic than our models have allowed. If we are to make further progress understanding what goes on when we mentally revisit the past, we must begin to build these dynamics into our models, right? The surest way to do this is to step outside the reigning paradigm, right? Just to reject this idea that we need memory traces in the first place. So maybe if we take neural dynamics seriously, the worry is that we couldn't have memory traces, right? These are challenges. So the challenge from neural dynamics are challenges to how we think about traces in some respects, right? But we need to make clear the distinction between saying that sustaining an Engram's persistent structure would require continual activity, upkeep, and sort of dynamical processes. Is that in the right way here? Right. And allowing that, I don't think I worded that exactly as I would like to word that, sorry. So the challenge from neurodynamics challenges both the processes which hold on to the trace and the idea that you could hold a trace in this sort of way over time. And there's a kind of assumption in the background of some of these views that any changes whatsoever are going to be inconsistent with the idea that you've maintained a trace over time. And I think that turns the kind of trace view into something of a straw man, sort of hyper-stabilized sort of view, a view that was available since no one had taken much time to spell out what's actually involved in the commitment to having a memory trace. So in order to have a memory trace, you do need some kind of persistent, distinctive structure. Surely the existence of those can be consistent with the ongoing sort of metabolic and upkeep processes of the brain, insofar as we are able to retain these kinds of particular experiences. And it is possible, the fact that there has to be some kind of distinctive and persistent structure, there's nothing yet built into that commitment that the nature of that distinctive and persistent structure can't itself change. So the sort of basis that's holding on to that could be altered over time in ways that still allow for something to be carrying that change. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular set of neurons or a particular set of neural connections that does that work. It might have to always be neural connections, but not necessarily connections A, B, and C. It might be able to be transferred to connections D, E, and F and still be the same sorts of change. In fact, in further work sort of making this point, I draw out the fact that in thinking about longer term aspects of consolidation, so neuroscientists think not only are memories supposed to stabilize when they get started, but memories are supposed to become sort of further stabilized across your lifespan. Many neuroscientists have already argued that engrams switch spaces, that they move from the hippocampus to frontal cortex. And that's been a widely, not everyone holds that view, but it's a prominent view of how consolidation works amongst neuroscientists, which involves a commitment to the idea that the engram was once here, and now the very same engram is in a different part of the brain, right? And if that idea has made sense for a long time, as like the possibility that the actual physical structure could change, so long as there is still a physical structure of this type, then the view is consistent with any kind of general threat from neural dynamics. So we don't necessarily, there isn't yet a reason to be worried about that. Right, so both of those claims are compatible with the core conception. Right. The second challenge, and this will be the last bit of things to talk about, is this sort of worry about the persistence and pervasiveness of memory errors. So since the beginning of work by Elizabeth Loftus in the 1970s, and a great deal of cognitive psychology of the 80s, 90s up through today, is just a sort of massive investigation of how easily our memories are distorted. So if you've taken a course in cognitive psychology, you've probably been subject to you can do these experiments on the fly and get people to think that they remember things that they don't remember. You can generate images of those things. Our memories are highly malleable and manipulable in a lot of ways, and in some ways that are somewhat surprising, right? So part of the reason this research gets attention is because until you started investigating it in these ways, you wouldn't have thought that our memories were so easily malleable, because we often feel very confident in them, right? So eyewitness testimony is a place where we know this well. People are certain that that's what they saw, right? They saw that person, and they saw that person here doing this thing. And it turns out that's actually the face of the person who worked on their car 3 days ago. They did see someone there, right? And they did see that face. They just didn't see those two things as part of the same event, right? But our ability to be confident in these memories is a challenge, and there are sort of systematic ways in which they can be distorted, right? So many people have thought, like, well, we should really start rethinking the way that we think about the nature of memory, right? If you thought that there were memory traces, if you thought memory is a matter of having experiences, retaining them, and then reactivating them later, then it would say, like, either one, that's the function of memory, right? So you would expect, if you actually think that memory errors are this pervasive, you're compelled to think now that the memory is not actually functioning very well most of the time. And so perhaps a better account is an account that rethinks the function of memory. So it's like, it was actually never meant, right? So instead of thinking that it was a mistake for it to squish two events together, maybe the function of memory is not to retain events. Maybe it's to put everything together and let us do new stuff with it, right? So a very common way of thinking about memory is in terms of this kind of, actually the function of memory is to amalgamate lots of events together. And we would do better to think about memory as being akin to imagination. And in fact, thinking about memory is just a form of imagining. It's a sort of a form of imagining based on the cumulative sum of all the experiences that we've had, right? And so it's not really about retaining the past. It's just like, ways we put things together make it feel like the past in certain cases. And obviously, if you hold a view of that type, and many people, especially in the cognitive neuroscience of memory do, and a great number of philosophers of memory as well, then you don't need memory traces anymore, right? Memory traces look particularly out of fashion because they don't fit with this idea, they don't fit with the explanation of memory errors in all of these ways. So one of the most prominent paradigms, if you know this, is the DRM paradigm. I could have done this too, like this is one you can do in like a class and get people to make these effects very quickly. So DRM stands for Deese, Roediger, and McDermott, 3 psychologists who sort of employed and perfected this paradigm. So in most versions of it, what happens is you give people a list of related items. I apologize if these are medical. I made this slide pre-COVID and I just keep using it. Should switch to one of their other examples, but it's sort of nurse, sick, medicine, lawyer, health, hospital, dentist, physician, right? I read you this full list of words, have you go do something else for a while, and then I bring you back and I ask you a set of questions. So I ask you whether something was on the list or not on the list. And if I gave you that list and I said, was hospital on the list? You would say, yes, so hospital here is a word that was on the list, right? And it's list consistent, so you say, yep, I remember that word. And for words that were on the list, you show a standard serial position curve, which means if I give you a whole list of stuff, you're really good at remembering the stuff at the beginning, and you're really good at remembering the stuff at the end, you're so-so in the middle, right? That's how memory goes. If I say, was Apple on the list, where there was sort of not obviously related to the list and wasn't on the list, you're pretty good. So if you look at this kind of graph of sort of averages, this is percent of recognition, and then where the item was in the list, the purplish here was the serial position curve. Apple, very few people say they remember Apple. I recognize, and this actually was one of the words they used. I guess you could have those sort of like apple a day sort of worry. But anyway, people don't say that they remember, they know that word wasn't on the list. But if you ask them, was doctor on the list? People say, yeah, doctor was on the list, right? And like they're confident the doctor was on the list. They remember it as well as words that were actually on the list. And so you can do versions of this where it's, snooze, pillow, tired, melatonin, snore, and then I ask you, was fire truck on the list? Was sleep on the list? And like when you hear sleep, 70% of people will say, yeah, it was on the list. And you say like, really? Like, do you feel like you remember, or like you actually remember hearing the word sleep? And people say, no, I remember hearing it. Because when I heard that word, it made me think about, and they'll give you some sort of story of the image that came to mind. If you read each of the words in a different voice and you say, well, which one of the voices was it when sleep? And they'll have an account of what it was like when they heard. So they're sort of generating kind of rich false memories of something they didn't actually hear. This is one of the most reliable effects in psychology. You can't get through a cognitive psychology class, I don't think, without learning this paradigm. And it's used as sort of baseline for testing all sorts of things. There was at one point, something like 30 DRM studies being published like per month. I mean, just variations. You can do this with lists of words. You can do this with images. The kind of basic framework of this is highly reliable, showing that you can easily get people like sort of systematically to report remembering things that didn't happen. Another very prominent version, just for those who don't know it, is the sort of the work from Elizabeth Loftus, the kind of basic misinformation paradigm, where you show people a car accident. These were done in the 70s, so they were actually showing people like image stills, not videos, but you can do it in that way as well. So I show them an image of the blue car and the red car in an accident. And if I say, how fast was the blue car going when it contacted, hit, bumped, collided, or smashed into the red car, as a function of that, you see the estimated rate of speed that the car was going go up, right? So your memory of how fast the car was going is impacted by the nature of the question that you're asked. This very clearly and obviously unintentionally has connections to like legal interrogation, right? So what kinds of things you're allowed to ask, right? Similarly, shown videos or image stills of cars stopping, a car that kind of rolls a stop sign and changing the stop sign to a yield sign, whether people recognize these kinds of changes in the ways those images are put forward, right? People can be given false information and not notice the difference. Showing again how easily memories, even when they're told like you're going to be an eyewitness to testify about this car accident, even when they're trying very hard, their perceptions are malleable and manipulable, right? So philosophers have started sort of trying as a function of this, as I said earlier, to rethink the function of memory, right? So we don't really need memory traces. Kirk and McCaffrey and Felipe de Regard have been two of the most prominent people arguing for this kind of a view, where it's not as if they think we don't retain information. This isn't the best photo for showing this, but I was trying to think of a sort of image that would bring the kind of idea of what they think is happening to mind, which is like, if you think of each thing that you remember as a kind of like you're lighting a candle and like sticking it in your sort of mental palace, eventually that wax is just going to melt, right? And it's going to melt down, and then you're going to get another one and put that in there, and then it melts down. So like, it's not like I don't retain, if each of those candles is one of the memories of my past experiences, all of that candle wax of all my past experiences is still in my head. It's just now all melted into one big thing, such that like all of it's in there. And of course, they're going to say it's slightly more organized than just a kind of melted ball of wax, right? But it's not as if I can go into that wax and find, maybe wax isn't the right medium for this, but it's close enough. I can't like pull out the wax corresponding to just that one candle that I cared about, right? They're kind of all merged and mushed together, right? So there are no memory traces. There's retention, but it's retention in a kind of generalized way, right? So what we have is a system that is sort of imaginative, right? I just take my big ball of wax and I think like, what do I think my 6th birthday was like? And I kind of make a guess and I put something together, right? Or I think about it as a way of sort of simulating what events were like or could have been like is effectively the same thing on that kind of a view. So I don't like that view, in part because I think that the kinds of errors that are involved in these sort of studies should actually be understood as instances of misremembering, which is a kind of false memory, but it's importantly different from completely making things up in the sense of imagining. People here have spent any time in philosophy of perception, and perception, when we talk about perceptual errors, make a distinction between illusion and hallucination, right? Something that is like a distortion of what you're seeing versus like seeing something that is not there. And in the case of memory, I think we should make a similar distinction between misrememberings, as sort of illusory, sort of distortions of what you remember, and confabulations, which are sort of whole cloth inventions of events that did not happen to you. And the vast majority of memory errors are misrememberings. They're distortions of what you remember. They're not cases where you don't remember anything, right? So the DRM paradigm only works because you actually remember what the list was like, right? Try as you want with these kinds of paradigms, you can't get people to think that Apple or fire truck were on the list, right? They think that these things are on the list because they remember what was on the list in general. I first got really excited about these cases because they're a sort of perfect philosopher's puzzle in a scientific case, and that like it's a kind of error. You get it wrong only because you actually remember what happened, right? So I don't remember because I do remember. At some level of description, that's what's happening in those cases, right? There's a way in which what I've retained has been distorted or manipulated, but something has to be retained that's about that list, not about words in general, right? And same with the cases of the car accident and the misinformation paradigm, right? It's not as if I'm thinking all car accidents happen the same way, right? Or I'm sort of generalizing. I'm taking what I remember and it's being manipulated or distorted by the kind of question I've been asked, but it's not as if I've lost the memory altogether. And in fact, some of the more recent work by a lot of the work with in cellular and molecular neuroscience has started to show that you can actually make non-human animal models of false memory with optogenetic techniques by actually being able to tag and track individual memories that animals form on the basis of having a particular experience. And then being able to activate that memory and distort it in certain ways, you get kind of false memory style effects in those cases. I can talk about that more in detail in Q&A if anyone has any questions, but basically showing that like once you look at the sort of animal, more mechanistic model of these kinds of misremembering cases, the best explanation of these cases is there is something particular retained and it gets distorted versus everything is all mixed together and that gives you these distortions. Okay, so many memory errors are distortions of content, not the absence of the trace. And trace theories can allow for changes to the trace content, right? It can be influenced by other processes. I think it would be a hard sell to argue that memory traces are utterly resilient to all these kinds of forces, given what the last several decades of cognitive psychology have shown us. Of course, these things are manipulable, but there just is something there to be manipulated. Okay, so that gives us, again, the sort of dual nature of memory traces as both physical and cognitive, but they can withstand most of these challenges. There are remaining questions about how, given that they can sort of change their physical medium and their content can be altered, we do face a lot of, to put it in very philosopher terms, sort of questions about how we're going to identify the persistence conditions of memory traces over time, how we're going to identify one and the same trace over and over, both empirically and sort of conceptually, how we're going to identify that. I think that sort of is the central problem that has to be articulated and sort of made apparent in the methodology by which we study these things going forward. So maybe there's not simply one way to do this, but we at least need to be explicit about the ways that we're making the choice to do that. So I said that's what I was going to do today. I was trying to convince you there was a core conception and it could withstand these challenges. So that is what I tried to do today by saying that we need a memory trace to retain particular past experiences that is responsible for distinctive physical and cognitive changes, allows you to have a range of views, and those views can withstand worries about dynamics and worries about errors. That's it.
I forgot to talk Q&A with you. For one, we have a convention where we'll let students ask the first couple questions. And then did you want me to take questions for you, or do you want to
do you mind? Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. Sure thing. So I'll take questions on Professor Robbins' behalf, and we'll have students have the opportunity to ask the first questions.
And remind listeners, Zoom.
Oh, yeah. And if you're listening in on Zoom, you can ask questions with the Q&A feature of the webinar. And wonderful Professor Robert Steele will concierge the questions for you and come up and ask them on your behalf. So do we have any student questions to kick things off?
Yeah, so this regards the DRM stuff. So there's the possibility that something is misremembered.
Yeah.
But I suppose there's also the possibility that something is remembered perfectly well, but one's account of the memory is somehow defective.
It's not effective, is that what you said? It's
defective.
Oh, defective.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, right. In the sense of, okay, so can you give me an example?
Well, I'm not sure I can. This is a fine conceptual distinction, but it seems that there's a possibility that we can separate the memory from our accounts of our memories. You know?
Good. Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is the distinction you're going for, but what I hear in that, or what I want to hear in that question is the distinction is that, there is this, so if we worry about whether memories will be accurate, there's a whole lot more to say about what would be involved in accuracy in terms of the kind of correspondence it has to have to the past event. And so sometimes philosophers want to make a distinction between what they call accuracy and authenticity, which I don't love that way of drawing the distinction. But one you might think of an example of this, you might think like, I go to, or I host a party and you all come to the party at my house, and I'm kind of in a bad way, and I'm just not having a great day. And so I assume that everyone hated the party, right? That didn't go well, and everyone was just sort of like, it just wasn't great, right? And so that's my read of the party. Turns out like you all actually had a fine time. I'm just in my head in a weird way about the experience. And then later, when you sort of ask, like, someone asked me how the party went, and I say, it was horrible. Like, no one had a good time, right? If it's about sort of like how I retained like, that's a perfectly accurate memory, and yet it's not an accurate representation of the event. So it's an authentic memory, as philosophers of memory have started using this term, but it's not an accurate memory. So the kind of question is like, the accuracy conditions are going to be kind of constrained by the thing I'm sort of aiming at characterizing. Am I trying to be accurate with regards to how it felt to me or how it actually was? That's one way you can pull that apart. I don't know if that's the kind of pulling it apart you're going for. So, this is important in some respects, because a lot of philosophy of memory has become kind of a thing in the last, say, 10 to 20 years. They're more like, that didn't really count as a proper subfield of philosophy 20 years ago, and I think it does now. And so prior to that, most of the people writing and working and thinking about memory were people in epistemology, and where the standard characterization of memory was as a form of retained knowledge, right? This idea that sort of that's what things were going to count as memories, were things that were known and then held on to, which is certainly a subset of the things that count as memory. But you might, depending on your conception of memory, think memory is sort of broader than that, that some things count as being remembered, even if you don't count as knowing them, for a range of different reasons, either because they're not accurate or you lack the right justifications or whatever other conditions you think are required. So there might be space. So one of the ways that philosophy of memory sort of got going was as people started to notice false memory cases and like, well, do these count as memories? So that, is our account of remembering factive? And even if it is it knowledge? Like those things started to pull apart, and there's starting to be more work to do just on this kind of cognitive state, as opposed to just this kind of knowledge-based state. So there's some space there. And yeah, so that's one of the ways that the kind of accuracy sort of worry gets going. And yeah, I don't know if that's your...
Yeah, that is very relevant. And I just wonder if the people that conduct the DRMs have a way of distinguishing between a memory that has been manipulated in some way upon reflection, or that the memory is intact and veridical, but one's reflection on the memory is somehow defective. And if that distinction could even be made.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure again if I'm getting at it in quite the way you want to on that front too. But you could think it's some sort of internal processes that are changed. And so sometimes there will also be updates to memories because where like historically, again, in the like literature on epistemology that dealt with this, people call these impure memories, like memories where it was formed in one way. So like you have a memory of looking out your window when you're 5 or 6 years old and you see this red bird in the tree. And like, it just, it's something that's always struck with you. Like, I don't know, it was Christmas morning or something. And right. And then later you learn that that's a cardinal, right? So like you used to think like, it's the day I saw this red bird in the tree. And now I describe that memory as it's the day I saw a cardinal in the tree, right? Or like, you have one read of what your relationships are like, and then you go to therapy and you have a different reading of what those relationships are like, but your memory is still the same memory. So there's kind of internal updates to content in that way that seem like they're just ways of, in some sense, the connections between your experiences. You're clearly putting things together and learning what passive aggressive behavior is, or what types of birds are, or whatever the thing in question is. But then other things, so that you might think of that as a kind of internal change, but maybe that's one that's sort of not worrisome with regards to accuracy, or sort of neutral on that question. And then you have other ways in which they can get manipulated, either from outside sources or even from you, right? Like we are infamously bad at, like if you're in a particular emotional state, it's easier for you to retrieve memories that are consistent with that emotional state and to highlight the features of those memories that are consistent with that. And if you do that enough at the right sorts of times, you can distort which aspects of the memories are most sort of salient to you and kind of lose track of the other features. So you can be the distorter as much as anyone else.
Okay, so the distinction can be held up.
It can be held up. Yeah, I mean, it will get messy, but you can hold on to it for a while, like any good philosophical distinction, but it will get messy. Yeah.
And then Robert, you have a webinar question from that?
Oh, no, this is actually just a follow-up on that question. See if I'm understanding it, or maybe like think of an example. So like if you thought of your memory trace as analogous to like an actual photo that you were like carrying around and you looked at, sometimes you look at a photo and you just like misclassify the information in it. Yeah. So you're like, I have this photo of the basketball game and I thought that like it was a 3-point shot or whatever, but it wasn't because I just visually misrecognized it. Like, is that possible with your memory traces? Could you have the memory trace be right, but you mess it up due to the way the question was asked to you or whatever?
I think so. So I think one of the, that's a great way of putting it. And I think one of the primary lessons of the memory error literature is not that we need to get rid of memory traces, but that what we need is a bigger distinction between holding on to a trace and the process by which it's activated and remembered and represented. And so like, if we think about those two things as separate forces, and I think we actually need that in some ways. So I think I haven't written that, I've thought occasionally, and I realize like people are watching this on video too, but I've thought previously, like actually that therapy is a really interesting case for thinking about, like you can learn from your past experiences and learn to reinterpret them in ways that require there to be this space between, like you've got, I mean, there are things you remember that you can kind of like old photos, look at from different angles and see and pull out different features of those events, especially by talking them through with someone in ways that help you sort of pull it out and use it in your life in different ways. And that's helpful. And like that wouldn't make sense unless the space existed and there was a kind of thing there to be looked at in some way. Good.
Okay, so we have Bree and then we got Jansel and William on it.
So we're talking about distortions. Do you think it's that we get a memory trace that is distorted and then we're able to go in and through whatever medium we use, like whether it's therapy or what have you, we kind of fix that? Or do you think that it's we have one memory trace that is a distortion, but then somewhere there's another one that is more accurate or that is more factual?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and really hard question. I think for different memories, it's going to go in different ways, possibly, depending on how far that goes and on how deep the distortion is into that memory. So I think sometimes that is what, like, I think sometimes you can have what are like sort of, I have memories of when I first remembered that event and saw it in a whole new way, right? And in that case, it seems like what's happened is I've got this kind of new, I have a new one, which is like my memory of remembering this thing, and it's altering and connecting to these things. And so I think there at least are some cases where that's clearly what's happening. And like maybe the original event is still tainted in some way, sort of how I think that content is kind of always going to be inherently messy, but now I've got this other kind of one that I can use to kind of get to it, and that one works better. And so I do, it's tricky to say. I like the kind of, now that there are these sort of empirical animal models of false memory, in part, that's kind of what we've needed in order to kind of start to triangulate on these questions, because I can't look at and manipulate the extent to which I can manipulate your human memories, right? That in empirical studies is going to be incredibly limited by ethical standards and like intervention level standards. And so, and for a lot of, important capacities that we care about, the ways that we make advances that involve those kinds of distinctions involve having animal models of those kinds of things. And until these more recent techniques developed, it really wasn't clear what that would even look like for memory, like false memory and kind of eyewitness testimony stuff didn't seem like the kind of thing there could ever be like a mouse model of. And optogenetics has really kind of changed some of that in some interesting ways. But so you might think that that's an interesting place for looking at, the ways in which some distortions, I think, are going to just fundamentally change the memory. But others might change just sort of how you access the memory. I think it's an important and interesting question. Like if you ask somebody something in a way that taints or distorts their memory, whether you've just ruined it. Right? So like if you are interrogated improperly, you're a wonderful witness for whatever's happened, but you have one bad interrogator, like maybe we can't undo that, right? Maybe like now your memory, and for certain things, it does actually seem to be the case. So for certain ways of doing like, eyewitness like lineup, recognitions, those can really, once you've done that, and if we show you, like there are now studies that show pretty effectively, you want to present people, if you're trying to get someone to, do an eyewitness recognition of someone, you want to give them people one at a time and say like, do you remember this person? Is this the person you saw? Okay, is this the person you saw? If you give people a lineup of people at the same time, the sort of way your brain interprets that is which thing is the closest to what I saw, right? And it will, in a lot of cases, land on something. And then that becomes the image in your head associated with what you saw, and you kind of can't unsee it from there. And that becomes very, very difficult. So if that's what most memories are like, then you'd need this kind of ladder story in a way. But yeah, it's a tricky thing to pull apart.
So first thing I want to say is that was really fascinating. So thank you for that, for the whole talk. I kind of wanted to pick up off of what Robert and Jacob were talking about. And I wanted to offer a potential alternative for what's actually happening. So let's take the list case, right? So my understanding, my very crude understanding is, of course, here's what we think is going wrong. You memorize this list, or you try to memorize this list, then we hide the list from you. Then we're gonna ask you some questions, and we're gonna try to trick you a little bit, right?
Mhm.
So we're gonna ask you one that we know is like related to the list because it's on the list, and you're gonna get that one right.
Yeah.
And we're gonna give you one that's way off kilter, and you're like, okay, that's totally wrong.
Yeah.
And then in order to claim this as an objection, what we want to say is your memory is either distorted, there is no trace, there's some error that's going on.
Mhm.
Here's an alternative explanation to what's going on that has nothing to do with with whether your memory is good, right?
Yeah.
Let's assume you actually have a crystalline, perfect image of that list.
Mhm.
You got a perfect memory, you saw the list. If you were to actually inspect that list, you would succeed every time in like
Mhm.
telling me what's on it and off
Yeah.
of it. However, you are a human being, and so you are cognitively very lazy.
Yeah.
You're extremely lazy. Our
Yeah.
brains do not want to so bringing that list back to mind and really inspecting it would be very taxing. I've experienced this where it's like, do you remember what happened yesterday? And like, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go for the general,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's much easier to think about. And if you're to ask me, no, but wait, what shoes was he wearing?
Yeah.
That's a lot more exhausting.
Yeah.
Couldn't it be that, and I don't know about all the cases, but at least oftentimes for this kind of test, what's happening isn't so much a case of misremembering as just overconfidence and laziness, where it's
Yeah.
like, look, the list was mostly about medical stuff.
Right.
You said doctor, yeah, the doctor's on the list, whatever. And if you like press me on it, now I'm entrenched. I don't want to
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I think there's actually, I do think there's something to that. I'm now going to stand up for we're not always that lazy. But so there are versions of the DRM where it is a free recall and you write down the words that you've heard, and people will put these words on the list even when that's the case. So it's, and this could be, there are ways you can incentivize good, there's 20 of you here doing this, you get the most extra credit for my intro psych course if you get them all right. So you can give people some kinds of incentives and these things still show up. You can warn them that this will happen and it will still happen. So these things, and in a way that suggests, and so those kinds of things complicate the extent to which that's the case. And they persist over time in interesting ways that make it even if you are generalizing and kind of being, I don't even want to say that it's laziness. I think this research has brought to mind really interesting questions about whether that's ultimately what the function of our memory is remembering kind of lists of items. The only time in your life that makes sense is when you're going to the grocery store. Otherwise, if I was in your class and you gave me 20 examples of something and what I don't extract is the general theme of how they're all related, then something has gone wrong, right? So, in most instances, you don't care what the last word of my sentence was, you care what my sentence was about. And so, maybe this is the fact that we're not that good at it is actually not a bad thing. It's a good thing about the way our minds work. And so I think there's some feature of that is going on here, but we do retain that they do influence kind of what it is we're capable of remembering. And so I think whether you call it laziness or kind of generalizational tendencies, that persists in the way that we think about things. One thing that's hard to reconcile with that is the kind of discrete, detailed testimony people are willing to give about these details, not just in these cases, but in lots of cases of false memories where people have, you think something happened. This used to happen more, I feel before all of the events of our lives were tagged in photos on social media in different ways. But it used to be that you think you had a super vivid memory of what happened on some occasion, and someone would finally dig up the one photo of that event, and you realize that you'd put the place where it happened and the people and the weather are all coming together from very different places. But in your head, you're just so certain of the way those things hang together. And those kinds of cases I think are harder. So why we do that at the same time that we're sort of lazy in a way is a weird feature of cognition, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna do everything wrong, and I just want you to set me straight.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start by giving a bad metaphor, which you've just told us we shouldn't use, and then I'm gonna use it to set up a question at the end.
Perfect.
So here's a picture of memory. I want you to imagine a whole bunch of dominoes with little pictures on them, right? So there's a birthday cake, there's balloons, blah, blah. And so we think of the brain mind as setting up all these dominoes set up, and that if you knock one over, it starts to spread in some certain ways. And, you know, sort of, we think of some dominoes get pushed closer and closer together. We
Yeah.
push the balloons and the birthday cake closer together through experience. And then when you ask me about my 6th birthday party, I plop down one of the dominoes and it spreads, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
And so start with that metaphor. Now here's the question. I don't know the difference between the generative model of memory and the trace
Yes.
theory anymore, because now, which is this?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, it's just a bad metaphor.
Yeah, no, I think I like that. I haven't used dominoes for the kind of generative view before, but mentally I really like that as a kind of like, because many of these alternate kind of constructivist imaginative views are sort of like that, right? You give me a cue, 6th birthday, and I kind of like, I set my dominoes loose, I pull, it knocks over cake, it knocks over balloons, and I use all the stuff it knocked over to build a memory of what that event was, right? And that, it does work to explain some particular past experiences. They might get my 6th birthday party 85% right, and like, that looks great. And so the generative model is going to do fine as explaining some particulars, so long as they are the most common, the most schema consistent, the most regular. But there's also that really weird, maybe it's not my 6th birthday, but there's the 8th birthday where like my grandma made pie instead and it was rain, like there are going to be cases that are anomalous, that like in the kind of spreading of the dominoes aren't going to fit in certain ways. And those are actually the ones we remember best. And so if I have this kind of domino view, I'm not going to be able to capture those cases.
So yeah, so the picture I want to say is, and what happens is in certain events, like 6 and pi get put in there really right next to each other, right?
Yeah.
And so that is why that one comes up in this kind of way, but it doesn't always get knocked over when I just think, his birthday, right? And that's why I was like, I couldn't see the line between this view as a trace view and as a generative view, because if what you're doing is you're putting in some dominoes very close to each other and locking that in, it seems both generative and trace.
Yeah, good. So I think that's possibly true. So I think in the details of how these things get put together, so if the mind is this kind of grand, like I'm now having like those YouTube videos of people knocking over massive amounts of dominoes, I'm really liking that as a mental, I'm going to have to add that to my picture slide. So if that's the kind of view that you have, then the struggle that you're going to have is like, so what are the relations between dominoes, right? Like this looks like associationism, and the kind of worries about like, well, associations come in many forms and types, and they're not all, it's going to be a little bit difficult to explain how those kinds of things work. I think ultimately, like clearly we have general associations, and those things influence and inform our memories, right? That's one of the things that does distort them, is that like, the kind of like events are usually like, when you ask me about birthday parties, like here are the things that usually come out in an answer to that kind of question might influence like what comes out, what I, build the memory out of that trace. But there have to also be these like little connections between things that happen, sometimes because they're weird, sometimes when they're not weird. Those kinds of cases are going to be trickier to include in this kind of domino cases. That, sometimes it's like, it's the one birthday in my life where we had pie instead of cake. So of course it sticks out. But other times things stick out even though they're highly repetitive. And in fact, sometimes even because they're highly repetitive. So feels like a bit of a tangent, but so I think it's interesting to look at cases of expertise for this reasoning. So people who are really, really good at doing something, but massive amounts of experience, have way richer conceptual knowledge than the rest of us about that thing, whether it's, sort of musical, like chess is a perfect example of this, right? People who play chess just see moves on a board when they see a board and can memorize boards more quickly than the rest of us because of this. They have their kind of domino structure around that is richer than people who don't. But along with that comes the ability to remember highly particular games they played and the sequences of moves that were involved in them in ways that like, there's no reason why these two particular, moves in sequence should stand out to them, given what they know, given the overall structure of their dominoes. Those instances, like there's got to be something else going on there besides the general associations between their dominoes. And so, kind of under all of this is a sort of call for like, yes, these kind of general principles are playing a huge role in cognition, but like that can't be all cognition is. In fact, as you get better at generalizing, you also get traces. So experts are I think, a key example of that, but in some sense, just richer versions of the rest of us. And so whatever your cognitive architecture, like if you think of cognition only in terms of massive amounts of generalization, as to this on Canon for 5 seconds, as deep neural networks, right, that are massive generalizers, and you don't have traces, it's not human, it's at least not human cognition. That's fine, Cameron, we might disagree about that. So yeah.
And so we've got, so just as a quick road map. So we'll probably end up starting like the next session, maybe like 10, we'll have just a couple more questions here. I'll actually give you guys 10 minutes. So, you know, our next speaker can set up the computer and you can mill around and grab sodas and chips and things like that. So we'll probably be starting, you know, little 10 to 12-ish minutes after. And our last 2 questions are going to be one from Hyson and then one from Robert, or Robert speaking for the webinar audience. Feel free to be short with your answers if you don't feel like,
Yeah.
you know, you can rush or leisure as you desire.
Thanks for the talk. It was super interesting. I actually, because there's a lot of examples about like memory errors and like misremembering, but like what about the people who have like perfect memory, right? Like who have like photographic memory, or people who have this like personal memory where they can tell you exactly what they did on like Tuesday, like 10 years ago or whatever, right? Like down to the detail of like what they were wearing and like who they talked to, like all this stuff, right? So are those like, I was just wondering how you would explain those cases.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there wasn't a lot of focus on those cases, both from the scientists themselves and then the kind of theory catching up with that. And I think there's 2 different kinds of cases. There's one, these like, well, first of all, like photographic memory is actually a very tricky case. It's unclear if that really exists outside of mystery novels, which I love, but I have to put them down every time they appeal to it. But for the other kinds, there are these cases like you were talking about the HSAM, like highly superior autobiographical memory. These people have like the creepy level, I mean, just disturbing to the rest of us levels of individual memory retention. Those cases, I think, have to be taken really seriously and are really troubling for the constructivists. The other ones that are super troubling are the kind of memory champion style cases, the ones where people like build a memory palace and they know 70,000 digits of pi and things of that sort. And those people swear, and the empirical evidence confirms, like the only difference between them and the rest of us is how we spend our free time. Like they're not smarter than us, they don't have different brain structures than us. This is like what they spend their time doing. And if you chose to do that, like we wouldn't all be the champion, but we'd all get really good. And that tells us that like the capacities for doing that are sort of built in. So I think taking those cases seriously is another challenge. So people in the science and the kind of philosophy of memory were so focused on the error literature. And it's only more recently that there's been a kind of like, you know, like if you go too far in explaining these, so maybe an exclusively accurate account was screwed up by the errors that we saw. But if now if you have an entire account based on theorizing off of the errors, you're not going to be able to explain that stuff. So yeah, I think those are another important test case.
So another question from me. I'm very self-centered that way. So you, at the beginning of the talk, you indicated that there were these various other arguments for memory traces that philosophers have made. You indicated that you found them largely unsatisfying. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the preventing causal gaps argument.
Yeah.
Because so here's something which, as someone who's uninformed in this field, sounds like a very decisive argument to me. I can tell you the opening line of the Coleridge poem Xanadu is, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree." There's nothing in the environment which has any, no one was talking about it. My saying that sentence must have been caused by something. Was it caused by a book with the poem or anything? Because I haven't read it since high school. Can't reach through space and time to cause that. So because it's got to be something in me. And also it has to be something content bearing, because the sentence was a sentence with content. And if those are the 2 criteria for memory traces, haven't we just discovered that there are memory traces?
Good. Yes. So so I think the causal gaps argument, I think the very short answer is the causation is necessary but not sufficient. And so in the straight up causal arguments as they go, they usually involve like saying something like, look, here's the experience, learning the poem, here's me reciting it. Those things are separated in time, but clearly this caused that. Causation doesn't have gaps, so something sustains the gap. That style of argument, one depends on part of it. So I think it's on the right track. So I think there's a causal theory of memory the ultimate trace account that I'm going to defend, like, is a kind of way of inverting the order of importance between the trace and the fact that it's a causal, like that it's a causal notion. But the fact that it's causation isn't necessarily going to get you all the way there. In fact, there are some people that are going to have views of causation that aren't worried about action at a distance and gaps. And it would be weird if memory went away because causation went, like if our views about memory changed because our theory of causation changed. And so we want it to be, that's a helpful background in sort of fleshing out the details, but it's not going to get us the full conception. So that one is kind of on its way in the right direction, but on its own can't get you all the way there. That's the answer.
Okay, let's put our hands together and thank. All on the bench and enjoy little bars, chips, sodas, things like that. I do actually just want to briefly thank people who provided organizational help for this. So in particular, I wanted to thank William Maliason, Yancel Garcia, Hyson Dang, Robert Steele in the philosophy department, along with Courtney Kopitz of Arts and Sciences, and also Stacy Geis in philosophy. And probably people I'm forgetting as well, but a lot of organizational help and work went into this. I just wanted to make sure to thank everyone who contributed to that.